Introducing Sony PlayStation, the breakthrough that takes gamers deeper into the game. It's totally immersive entertainment, and it forever changes the rules of the game.
Sony Computer Entertainment, 1994. The release of the new Sony PlayStation heralded the start of a new era in video games. CDs would let games hold more data and include more complexity, and designing and programming games was about to change too. Many decades before, the inception of the dedicated video game console had changed the way games were made too. Instead of using a computer, game consoles would develop hardware and software specific to their devices for game developers to program their games. To create a game for a console, you needed the console itself, and were limited to what that device could handle. Years later, enter the PlayStation. When Sony's first game console was released, they would make a decision that would revolutionize game development for their system. Instead of releasing specialized hardware for game programming, they would offer a game design toolset for the computer that was meant to create PlayStation games. It was a major change. Programming on a PC gave the toolset way more power than previous generations had had. It meant the programmers could use C or C+ languages to program in, instead of more archaic styles, and it would go a long way towards allowing PlayStation games to become larger and more complex. Programming Silent Hill would involve several divisions, 3 sets of programmers dividing the work between them. This was an age when games were getting big enough and complex enough that such divisions were necessary. In the past, games typically only had a single programmer, or perhaps 2 working on the game, programming every aspect and testing it all themselves. Silent Hill would be far too large and complex. In total, 6 people would be designated as programmers on Silent Hill, including Oshima Naoto, the graphic system programmer, whose work I discussed in a previous video. He would program the fog, the water, the snow, and the camera angles of the game. There would also be a digital technician, Imaizumi Kenichiro, more famously known for his involvement in Metal Gear and many years working alongside Hideo Kojima. He's worked on dozens of games, including Suikoden, Castlevania, Vandal Hearts, Shadow of Destiny, Metal Gear Solid, and Death Stranding. He wouldn't be involved in Silent Hill in a central way again until many years later on Kojima's PT. In other fields, digital technicians are involved in creating models and presentations as part of the planning stage of creating a project. His name happens to be listed as a collaborator on the game's CG on the SIGGRAPH document discussing Sato's work, which may mean he was involved in planning the CG cutscenes with Sato Takayoshi. The testers, planners, and programmers would be essential for Silent Hill's development, not only because they would build the framework of the game themselves, but because of the invaluable feedback they would give and the atmosphere they would help create. When creating a game, it all comes down to programming. What can the computer handle, and how can it do it? No matter how good your musicians or artists or designers, without a solid program backing it up, nothing will work correctly. When starting to design Silent Hill, Toyama Keiichiro would first speak to his programmers to figure out how they could begin building the project. It was these programmers who convinced Toyama a fully 3D game was not only possible, but preferable. And they would adapt Toyama's fog concept, taken from The Mist, and ingeniously use it to hide flaws in the game. It was programmers who designed the shadows and lighting effects that would give the town its atmosphere, and they would be behind the haunting otherworld transitions. The game system itself, the foundation of Silent Hill, would be programmed by Imamura Akihiro. He joined Konami in 1992, programming for Sexy Parodius and International Track and Field in 1996. Imamura was involved from the very beginnings of the game, as part of the central team who developed the game's core concepts, and would be central to the series later on. In fact, he's likely the only person at Konami to have his name on Silent Hill, Silent Hill 2, the update of 2, Restless Dreams, Silent Hill 3, 4, and the Japanese-only Clay novel. Horror wasn't really an interest of Imamura's. As part of the central team, he was involved in researching for the game by reading books and watching movies in the genre. What he enjoyed was suspense. Stories that were more than simply frightening, but were difficult to understand, bordering on the absurd. As main programmer, he was heavily involved in all aspects of the project, even more so than he would be later, as producer for Silent Hill 2. That role would lead him to feel more isolated from his team. He had greater control on the project, but less hands-on experience working alongside everyone. A central policy of Silent Hill that stems from his influence is the lack of health bars or game-like aspects on the main screen. He felt it was important for the atmosphere to keep those limited. Instead, players' health would be reflected in the way the main character was programmed to move. Harry would breathe harder and move slower when he was badly injured. It was more realistic and more immersive than having a bar on the screen. It would be Imamura who made the decision to include difficulty levels in later games, for both riddles and action aspects. He didn't want nervous or uncertain players to be kept from playing the game due to a steep difficulty. Character programming was handled by Mizuochi Yuki. Starting at Konami in the early 1990s, his first project was on The Final Round, known in Europe as Konami Open Golf, in 1996, and he joined the Silent Hill team in its early days. He would continue as a programmer on the series through 3, before moving to Metal Gear. He's still at Konami today. It's interesting he moved from Silent Hill to Metal Gear, perhaps a choice he himself influenced. In the program book for Silent Hill 3, Mizuochi was asked what he wanted to work on next, and his answer was something like an American comic book hero. The protagonists of Silent Hill were all ordinary humans, which meant he was limited in how wild he could be programming them. Character programming is just like it sounds. The character programmer creates programming for the characters. The most extensive character would of course be Harry. Mizuochi would be behind programming his actions in the game, the way he runs, walks, attacks, uses items, and how he dies. Mizuochi would continue on the Silent Hill series programming for the characters in more and more depth. The next games would involve specialized reactions and vibrations in the controller, dependent on which various weapon the player was using. In one of the Silent Hill 2 guides, Mizuochi says his favorite character was James. He's just fond of him. No doubt, as character programmer, he and James spent quite a lot of time together. Programming the enemies would be a large job, since there were quite a few of them, and 3 programmers would be assigned to make the movements of Silent Hill's monsters. Ogiso Kazumasa started at Konami in the early 90s, working on Suikoden in 95, Ganbare Goemon in 96, and Azure Dreams in 97. From there, he joined Silent Hill. For the second game, he would be working on converter programming. In gaming, converter programming refers to when the program of a different game or project is changed to match the new project, like converting an arcade game's code to work on a console. He was likely working on converting older code from the first Silent Hill on the PlayStation into code that could be used for the new PlayStation 2. He would also work on the Restless Dreams version of the game for Xbox, and the converter program for Silent Hill 3. From there, he'd move to Metal Gear. Fun fact about Ogiso's contribution to the series: when it came to creating endings for the Silent Hill games, the team would come up with a game to farm ideas for a goof ending. A suggestion box was set up with the question, what's the real reason Silent Hill is like this? One of the answers given was a dog, and the team was delighted by the idea. They pushed it through to become one of the endings of Silent Hill 2, in spite of the fact that the voice actor for James, Guy Sihi, absolutely did not understand it or think it was funny. Harry Inaba insisted to him it was Japanese humor and he give it a shot. The original idea for the dog ending was apparently Ogiso's. The second monster programmer would be Sugai Kazutoshi. Silent Hill was his first game project, and he too would be involved in the series through 2, Restless Dreams, and 3, working on system programming. He would continue at Konami in various roles through 2011, working as production support on Rumble Roses, various sports and dancing games, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Game adaptations. A Japanese site listing game patents assigned to Konami has a fascinating reveal for the development of the series. A quick summary of the patent. The problem: how can the player know the state of their character's health without interrupting their play? The solution: a controller that puts out a vibration that corresponds to the player's health level. It's written in more obscure language, but that's the idea. It's a patent for Silent Hill's heartbeat vibration, filed March 3, 1999, with the inventor named as Sugai Kazutoshi. The last monster programmer would be Owaku Hiroyuki. He joined Konami in April of 1997, and Silent Hill would be his first project. He was 22 years old and fresh out of school, and he was hired to work on both enemy programming and a somewhat new technique at the time, event programming, which is what would lead him to develop all the various riddles of Silent Hill. In older games, player input was interpreted by the use of if-then loops. The game would constantly be checking certain inputs to see if terms had been met. For instance, if the player pushes the A button, the game interprets that behavior and activates the associated action. For simple games, these loops are enough to keep the programming going. But when games get more complicated and need more actions than can be held in a few loops, then the answer is to use event programming. Events do something similar, but instead of checking for input in a constant loop, the game waits for a specific trigger. For instance, if the player uses a key on a door, that can trigger an event which unlocks the door. Event programming thus involves creating all the intricate systems of player actions and inputs that allow Harry Mason to interact with the world around him. Which is why it makes perfect sense that Owaku was also in charge of writing and designing the riddles for the game. Event programming would involve all these riddles. Use the acid on the old man's hand, and it triggers an event which melts the hand and reveals the medallion. It's only natural Owaku would be in charge of riddles when he'd be programming them to begin with. Over the years, lots of fans have dug into Silent Hill's code and found a lot of fun things. A major find involved unused images from the official PlayStation Magazine demo disc, which revealed some early concept art, and a lot of dummy images that were likely placeholders in the game at some point. What's more interesting is that many of them have Japanese text on them, and the context of what they look like, what's written on them, and what they were used for seems to imply they were written by Owaku. The set of images include instructions for how certain scenes in the game would work. For instance, one explains how there would be a hole that the player would route water into, revealing a key elsewhere in the building. There's a note about the various time puzzles across Midwich, explaining what they should look like. These notes feel like rough sketches of early puzzles and problems in Midwich and the hospital, and they are likely from Owaku. As riddle designer, he was likely behind the location of hidden items, keys, and other puzzle-like aspects. In addition, one line in one of the images seems to imply the writer must have been a programmer. In the image here, the writer says they aren't good at using soft image. The writer then goes on to explain the art that should be replacing the dummy image. Said image is of a hunter and a giant lizard, as the writer helpfully sketched out. Soft image is the program used by artists, which tells us the writer of these notes isn't someone with artistic skills. That excludes Toyama Keiichiro. He was also a background designer. Owaku, as a programmer and riddle writer, seems the best fit to be the author of these notes. More notes mark the locations of items and keys. This one says, "Here is the key," over top a picture of the doghouse, where in-game the 11th Street house key is hidden. The first line on this image reads, "Dummy," and it's followed by what seems to be a bit of game dev humor. It reads something to the effect of, "There's no blood. Actually, there's bloody writing." This was probably because the image of the bloody writing in a book wasn't created yet, and was meant to poke fun at the fact that the dummy image didn't look that way. Other pictures of the door to the otherworld seem to say, "Otherworld Awakening Door," and pairs up with a second image that marks the middle square and says, "There is a slit here," the location in the game where the player uses the picture card. The strangest one of all is a quote from Geoffrey Chaucer. It's an approximation of a line from The Knight's Tale, "Death is the end of every worldly sore." It's possible this quote, which appears nowhere in the series, might have been a placeholder for the quote which inevitably ended up in the beginning of the first game. Perhaps it even inspired it. After Silent Hill, Owaku would take on a larger role developing the Silent Hill universe. Not only would he continue writing riddles, but he would also develop the scenario of the games, write much of the script, and help build the lore of the second and third games. It would be Owaku who named the creature Voltiel, and Owaku who made the decision to write a story for a young woman in Silent Hill 3, and it would be Owaku who created the character of Walter Sullivan. After the first 3 games, Owaku would be assigned to an unknown project, alongside other Silent Hill veterans Ito Masahiro and Hatakeda Norihito. The project would be cancelled in 2006, and Owaku's official credits would seem to end. Truthfully, he's still at Konami, heavily involved in projects aimed at the Eastern market, including online games for South Korea and phone apps, and phone applications based on major properties. He's won awards for his work, and taken on a larger, more managerial role as general producer. He made an onstage appearance at an event for a series called Buso Shinki, to the surprise of its fans. Many Western fans, in chat rooms and across social media, have lamented that Owaku is being wasted in such terrible positions, and how could Konami do this to him? Creating the picture of a man dragged in chains into a very successful job in a position of authority at a major company. The truth is, Owaku was done with Silent Hill after 3. He wanted to move on, to create something else, and he had thoughts of creating something that would affect people's lives, as he wasn't sure he'd done that yet. Well, I would argue he certainly has, many times over, affected the lives of people around the globe with his work on the Silent Hill series. It is also arrogant of Western fans to discuss his professional life as if it was in some way a failure, simply because he isn't making games they like anymore. Whatever projects Owaku chooses to work on in the future, they are sure to benefit from his input, and he can rest easy knowing he has had a major, positive influence on countless fans of Silent Hill. To all the programmers of the first Silent Hill game, a very heartfelt thanks for helping build a world we all love.